Hey guys, Brent Hull Build Show at my house. Going to look at a couple different era base moldings, and I'm going to explain why shoe mold doesn't belong on your projects. Come join me. Okay guys, so just looking at historic precedent, you gotta remember that we've got two different eras here. We've got this handmade era, pre-1860, and then we've got machine-made era after that time, 1860 all the way up to present day. In the colonial era, and if you remember, if you watched my plinth block video, it talks about the history of the plinth block, and kind of, if you look at those historic rooms of Drayton Hall and Gunston Hall and some of those other really great houses, there is no shoe mold in those houses. The plinth sits right down, and it's because it's an architectural element, it's an architectural detail that the plinth is the base, is the grounding piece that everything is coming off of. And so introducing a quarter round or a shoe mold shape, it messes up the strength of that plinth, okay? Now, as we go forward into the 1860s, into the industrial era, I'm going to show you some pictures from some plan books and some pattern books where, it shows bases, it shows casings, but and I got an 1860s catalog, there's no shoe mold, 1870s, 1880s. Going into the 1890s with the very first manufacturer's catalog, there is no shoe mold in there, okay? Now, getting into the early 1900s, you find a few examples of shoe mold. You find examples of what's called a floor mold, okay? And there's even one in the 1927 catalog of a slotted kind of tongue and groove kind of shoe mold in the way they go together. None of those things shown in the catalog really represent, the shoe mold at least we use, which is a 1/2 inch by 3/4 inch tall material that doesn't really show up until the 1940s. It really isn't that common. In my experience, it's something that not even the trim carpenters are putting in, but the flooring contractors are putting it in after they do a sand and finish. Moldings of an historic nature, okay, moldings where the base mold grows 5-6 inches tall, okay, which would be a kind of a typical average for a pre-1940 house. By the time you get into the 70s and 80s, moldings continue to shrink and shrink and shrink. And if you go to Home Depot and pick up a base molding, there's base moldings that are literally 2 1/4 inches tall, right? Well, now if you add a 3/4 inch shoe mold, you've got 1/3 of your base molding covered up by a shoe. Now, that speaks to how big the shoe is relative to the size of our gap. If you're building new houses, there's no reason to have a shoe mold at all, okay? Because hopefully you can build your houses flat and square enough that you don't need to cover up a 1/2 inch gap with a 3/4 inch piece of wood. If you're doing a remodel, okay, work to scribe the base so that it sits down on the floor. Work to do a few things so that you don't need to introduce that shoe mold. The shoe mold ends up being something as a craftsman, guys, that I want you to, throw out, okay? It's like, for instance, with cabinetry, okay? A lot of cabinet guys will come measure their cabinets, make sure they're tight enough, and then they'll come along and they'll put a little piece of wood or something to cover the gap. Whereas good guys, okay, build their side frame big enough so that they can scribe it into an opening, slide it in, and it can caulk up with a 16th or 8th inch gap, and you don't need to cover it up with wood. I want us to be precision builders. I want us to craft in a way that we don't need that. Now you'll notice here in our house, this is a 1960s house. It's actually gone through a number of iterations. The original molding was a clamshell molding, right? The next molding was the one you could see if you go to the back of our house, which we haven't redone yet. Done probably in the 90s. It's actually a door casing. They put a door casing down as their base mold. And so then we came back and put this. Now this is the Windsor Greek Revival package. This is my favorite style of the Windsor line we designed back almost 20 years ago. It's timeless. It actually comes from Asher Benjamin, one of his books. It's their Greek Revival package. There's Greek shapes in it, but it's very appropriate for a modern home like this, a 60s ranch, because of the shapes, the clean lines, and everything else. You'll see in our house here, I love how we got this big back band. We've got the base that runs into it, that there are real sharp lines and real sharp shadow lines and details in the color. The paint as it hits that wood floor is really distinctive. But there's no shoe mold, okay? One, that gap is maybe, if I go along here and feel with my finger, 1/8 of an inch or less. You don't really see it. If a client's picky and they want you to caulk that line, you can, but this is a way to really express the sharp line of the base, the sharp lines of the back bend in the casing, and it just looks better. You guys know, if you've worked with shoe mold, sometimes you can end up with funky details. For instance, if your base molding or if your casing doesn't have a big back band or a strong enough back band, you can get into a situation where the shoe mold can come along and actually stick out past the casing. Think about it, okay? We have an 1/8 inch gap, and you're putting a 3/4 inch piece of molding to hide this gap, okay? It doesn't make any sense. And it costs more money. It doesn't look as good. It creates problems possibly with different molding packages that you're using. So stop using shoe mold, bottom line. Okay guys, so shoe mold, I want to challenge you that it's a precision test, okay? You can build your floors flat enough and touch your base tight enough that you don't need a shoe mold, okay? So if that reason alone, further, sometimes a shoe mold can overwhelm a baseboard. And so if you're using small moldings and stuff, you don't want a 3/4 inch tall piece that communicates. And then finally, as a classical piece, let your strength of your baseboard set down on the floor and carry the weight of your walls. You don't need that extra shoe mold to try to cover that gap or help architecturally. There's no help that it does architecturally. Hopefully you understand why I don't like shoe mold. Hopefully you'll take the challenge and start building your houses without it. That's my challenge to you. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and Facebook. A lot of fun stuff we're doing there. Sign up for the newsletter. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.